in this one, what we're going to do is go ahead and figure out how to write global variable conditional statements so that we can know whether or not we actually need to call the jQuery and all this other JavaScript and specialized CSS for the lightbox and for the carousel. And if we have already called it, then we don't want to call it again, right? So let's figure out how to do that. But before we launch into figuring it out right here, let's just do something that's a lot simpler. I'm going to create a new file that is just going to be a little test file, okay? And let's just get rid of all this. It's just going to be a little test script so that you can kind of see a little bit better what I'm talking about. So let's just save this as, I'm not going to save this in my main display images. I'm actually just going to save it up here in the top level of my dev folder. All right, so don't be confused by that. This is just a little test just to show you something. So, I'm going to call this file global scope and save it. And I'm going to just go ahead and create a function real quick, because what we need to think about is whether or not, let's just call this test global or something like that, okay? And the reason that we're going to do this is we need to think about whether or not we're going to be able to use a variable that is outside of our function. And if you remember, whenever we sort of talk generically about functions, you're really not allowed to use variables that are outside of a function. Like, you can't pull a variable into a function, and you can't use something that you've created inside of the function as a variable. You can't, call that same variable outside the function. It's really only good inside the function. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you remember, let's just look back really quickly over here at test04, is that every time I call one of these functions, it is discrete and separate from the next time that I call it. So if I, announce a variable, let's say I just announce it here and I say, right here, for instance, that I announce that something exists, well, it only exists during the course of the existing function that I'm calling. And then the next time I get to the next one, it doesn't exist anymore. So what you have to do is you have to make sure that you're calling something globally, so that whenever I call it globally here, then now it actually exists inside of this page, and it can hop between this function and this function. Like, you can just hop in and out of each function, right? And because it exists globally. All right, so let's go back here. And before I show you the global stuff, what I want to show you is what happens whenever we don't call a global variable. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and tab in, and let's just do some like little conditional statement. And we're going to do something only if, the variable is not set. All right, because the idea is that once we set the variable, like once we fire the jQuery or the JavaScript, right, then we don't want to keep doing it over and over. So we could do something like if, let's just do our basic syntax first. And I'm going to go ahead and do an else statement. We might not do else later, really, but what I want to do is an if else so that we can see something on the screen. So the first thing I want to do is, let's just say that we're going to be creating something in our first position that is a variable called, let's say, JavaScript. Okay, so our variable will be JavaScript. And if we want to be really specific, we could say, actually, and what we want to say is if JavaScript does not exist. And what we could do to be even more specific is, instead of saying if not JavaScript, we could just say if JavaScript is not set, is set, like this, and then I'm going to come over here and put my closing parenthesis. So we're going to say if the JavaScript variable is not set already, then what we're going to do is come down here first of all, and we'll say echo JavaScript, can't type right now, triggered here or something like that. Okay, and I'm going to put a horizontal rule just so it is really clear and simple. And then I want to go ahead and I want to initiate the JavaScript variable, because here we're saying, well, if it's not set, then go ahead and announce the JavaScript here. And now I want to set it so that it doesn't continue to set it in the future, right? So here, let's just go ahead and we'll say JavaScript equals true. Okay, so we're going to basically set the variable to exist so that it does exist. So that next time if it comes up here when it's testing to see if it doesn't exist, if it has already been called, then we set it to true and it's going to fail and it'll go to else. And then here we'll say, in the else condition, we'll say something like already fired the JavaScript. I'll just put the JS, okay? And then what I'll do here is I'll put, let's do another break. Let's do a break tag or something instead of a horizontal rule this time. So it's visually different, okay? So let's just do something like that. And then now down here, we actually have to call. So we have to call the function, which is test global. So I'm going to just copy that. Okay. And then what I'm doing here is I want to call it multiple times, because that's the idea, is that we're testing to see what happens whenever we create the JavaScript variable here and we say, okay, it does exist. Whenever we create it the first time, right here in test variable or test global, it doesn't exist the first time. Okay, it shouldn't exist. And then by the time we finish that function, it should exist, right? Okay, and then in theory, if the world were really simple, then it would already exist, and then the second test global would echo out already fired the JS, and so would the third one. All right. Notice that I haven't done anything to make a global variable yet. So I want to just show you this. Hit save. Let's go back over here and let's go. I'm going to load this page. And look what's happening. It's saying JavaScript triggered. Well, that's not what we want. Remember, we don't want the same JavaScript to be triggered 3 times in a row on the same page. We don't want the entire jQuery library to load 3 times. That's the problem we're having. And specifically, we're having that problem with Lightbox. It's doing something very weird. So what we really want to have happen is if you just come up here, like on my line 3, I'm going to drop it down. And then what we're going to do is we're going to announce global JavaScript. You announce it before you use it. Okay, so we're saying, okay, this variable is going to be global. And then you check to see, okay, if JavaScript isn't set. And by the way, this isn't necessarily setting it. It's announcing a global variable. Okay, it's just making something global. If JavaScript is not set, right, it's the same thing. Okay, so let's just see what happens if we save this, come back here, hit refresh. And you see here, it fires it once, and then it goes, oh, hey, wait a second, it's already been fired. Oh, it's been fired. And it would keep doing that over and over and over. So that's a really simple version of what we're going to do. And I think that it's a little bit easier to see it here. If you're not completely getting it, just remember that this line, if we wanted to go and put some comments, line 3, so we'll say next line, announces global variable, okay? And then here's where we set the condition. And then we want to test to see if it's not set, then you know, print JS to screen first time only, and then JS has already been called. And then we can say skip it. All right, and so here because I'm saying, okay, this is where we'd actually skip it. Technically, we probably wouldn't really have this else section. The reason that we have it is so that we can just see what's happening on the screen, okay? But this is what's really going on, okay? So if we want to go back here to our test 04 and we want to take a peek, excuse me, to our functions page, and we want to take a peek, you can see now how we would call this only if it hasn't been called using this condition and global statement. Okay, so let's just do something. Look, I'm going to take, this is the lightbox. I'm going to take this, and for right now, I'm just going to put it inside of an HTML comment, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here before the ending of my PHP tag, and I am going to go ahead and I'm going to announce global. And I'm going to announce, I'm going to create a variable, let's just call it jQuery for like the jQuery library. And if I put a comma here, I can announce two global things at once. I can also say lightbox, because this is our lightbox case. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make both of those variables global. All right, these don't exist anywhere else yet. So now, if we wanted to go based off of our other model, right, we need our if statement. So we want to do if. Let's go ahead and put our basic syntax here. Okay, so we're going to say if is not set. So we need our bang symbol to say not. All right, and then that's our basic syntax with the two parentheses. And what we're going to say, let's just test first for jQuery. Okay, so first we're going to test for jQuery. So in fact, I can put like a quick little note here. We're going to say test to see if jQuery library has been called. Okay, all right, and then if it hasn't been set, then what we want to do is, let's just say echo. Let's just keep all of this in the PHP, and I'm just going to put this in single quotes, okay? So we're going to go down here, and we're going to take the jQuery library. And the reason I'm doing single quotes is you see here we've got double quotes, all right? So we need to make sure that we keep all that stuff straight, all right? So we've got single quotes, and we have that. And then also, just so that I can make sure that everything gets printed on a new line and it doesn't all run together, I'm going to concatenate here, and in double quotes I'm going to put \n, not forward slash, but backslash, and that'll make sure that in the HTML it prints it on a new line. And then the next thing I want to do is now I actually need to make sure that I set this jQuery variable to be true so that it will exist now in the future. So we'll say that jQuery is true. Okay, and I don't need an else statement because if this fails, then basically nothing will happen. So that's okay. So what I can do now is I can just copy this if statement. All right, I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to, actually, let's just copy this whole thing with the comment. I'm going to copy that and come right down, and we're going to say test to see if lightbox library and CSS has been called. And then here I'm going to change this to the word lightbox. And then I'm also going to, you need to make sure that you're changing the script that's loading. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to swap these guys out. Okay, and then the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to echo two things. I'm not just going to echo the lightbox.js. I'm also going to be echoing the lightbox CSS, and I'm just going to copy the style sheet, and I'm going to replace this whole script thing right here and change this to lightbox. Save and test. Okay, so let's come back over here, but we're going to go to our regular page where it's spinning. Let's hit refresh. And if I scroll down to the bottom, you see that no longer do I have that other weird thing, and my lightbox galleries should both be working. Let's see here, both working, and we're in a better place. Now, we still need to do something very similar like that for this other carousel. So let's go ahead and take care of that.